Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, might have been a bit loud. Can everyone hear me okay in the back? Perfect. My name is Dr. James Herrera Brooks, and I serve as the Melanie Trent DeShutter Senior Director for Research and Publications here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this noontime lecture in our regular scholar series. We wish to acknowledge the generous support of Comrade Mercer Hall, who has endowed the VMHC Scholar Series. Comrade serves as an honorary vice chair of the Board of Trustees of this institution and has been a champion of our work for decades. We also wish to acknowledge former VMHC President and CEO, Dr. Charles F. Bryan, whom this series also honors. I also want to, make everyone aware, of course, today is also Juneteenth, which is a day dedicated to commemorating and recognizing Black emancipation in the American Civil War. And I think it's very fitting that today we're going to be having a talk about Elizabeth Van Lew, a noted abolitionist. And of course, I think that speaks to that ongoing, enduring legacy of allyship across racial lines in the quest for racial justice. Before we begin with today's lecture, I just want to make you aware of our next upcoming Scholar Series lecture. So that's going to be held on June 26th at noon here in the Robbins Forum. And we're going to be welcoming Francis Gary Powers Jr. Gary will be here to talk about his latest book, Cold War Virginia, in which he discusses the Commonwealth's central role in US involvement in the Cold War. And as we move on today to introducing today's speaker, I'd just like to remind you all to take a moment to check your mobile phones, your cell phones, and make sure they're switched to silent, do not disturb, or off. The wealthy Southern Richmonder, Elizabeth Van Lew, had it all: money, charm, wit, and one of the most elegant homes in the city. So why did she risk everything to become a spy? The answer is simple: freedom. From her earliest work infiltrating prisons and collecting Confederate secrets, she crossed paths with assassins, socialites, and escape artists. As the war ground on, Elizabeth grew bolder, developing a network of spies which included enslaved people. She secretly crossed enemy lines, developed agents in the Confederate War Department, and collected the secrets that would prove critical to General Ulysses S. Grant's prosecution of the war in its closing days. Now, today's talk is not necessarily going to, regale the life of Elizabeth Van Lew, who's a figure who's very familiar to us here in Richmond. But today's very talented speaker is actually going to be talking about her own journey of research and discovery in uncovering this story, and of course, translating it into the wonderful storytelling in her latest book. Gerri Willis, of course, is an award-winning journalist, television personality, podcast host, and author. Currently a correspondent and anchor for Fox Business, she was the host of 2 long-running shows for CNN and an editor and reporter for Smart Money, Crain's New York Business, and others. Her journalism has earned her the prestigious mid-career Knight Baggot Fellowship from the Columbia Journalism School. She is the author of several books, the most recent being Lincoln's Lady Spymaster, the untold story of the abolitionist Southern belle who helped win the Civil War, which, as I said, is her latest book, the subject of today's talk, and as Gerri herself found out very recently, now a New York Times bestseller. So let's give her a wonderful round of applause and welcome her to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture.
Hello, hello, hello. Hi. Are you out there? I'm going to be honest. I'm just a little nervous because you guys normally listen to historians, and I'm not a historian. As you just learned, I'm essentially a business reporter. I talk about treasury secretaries, yield curves, PE ratios typically, and I do it in 90-second increments. So this is very different for me. But the project of this book was really the love of my life for 3 long years. I had a great time working on it, and I hope I can share some of this enthusiasm with you today. As it was just mentioned, this is Juneteenth, right? and it has us focused on the truth of our historical narratives and the difference that is between myth and reality. That was a theme I was to come across several times in doing the book. And the idea of the book is not to change settled history, but to add to it, to incrementally add to the people that we know are critical to the nation and how we live in it today. Thank you for having me. I'm humbled to be here, as I said, to speak at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And I just wanted to add, I can really credit the Commonwealth, Virginia, for making me so interested in history. I lived in Norfolk, Virginia. I do know how to say that, Norfolk. And I was a cub reporter at the Virginian Pilot and Ledger Star, what used to be called the Virginian Pilot and Ledger Star. And as you do when you're a cub reporter, you go see all the sites in your area, right? I went to Jamestown and Colonial Williamsburg. I came here to Richmond, knocked around the fan, went to some of the museums, and I started becoming fascinated by our nation's story, collected a lot of books, and that eventually led me to try to do this, to do something of more length. Now, a lot of people ask me why I wrote the book, and the real answer is that during the COVID lockdowns, I work in New York City at Fox. We have a lot of young women producers there, and during the lockdowns, they were angry, anxious, really nervous. One of them even started having panic attacks, and I thought, American women have done some pretty cool things under difficult circumstances. What if I found a story to tell them about at length? And this was one of the stories I came across. I actually started compiling a list of cool women names that I might write about. One of them, of course, was Harriet Tubman, who you see here. And I'm sure you're familiar with her whole story, saving people on the Underground Railroad. She's famous for that, but there's an even bigger story about her that I found compelling, the Combahee River Raid, in which she freed hundreds of slaves from South Carolina plantations, rallying Black riverboat pilots to help her bring white soldiers to the plantations, raid them, and free these slaves. The story is fascinating, and there's a new book out about it. You should, if you're interested, it's called Combahee. It's written by a woman whose relatives were freed in this whole raid, and it just won the Pulitzer Prize, I think. It's an amazing book. The other person I considered, Frances Oldham Kelsey, was a brilliant scientist and FDA drug reviewer, and she refused to authorize thalidomide in the United States. Are you familiar with that story? Yes. It's amazing. Imagine if we had to deal with that. So I compiled a list of about a dozen of these women and pitched it as a book in New York City. My agent toted it around to all the major publishing houses. I had a name for the project, America's Hero Women. Not really that compelling, right? Well, guess what? The editors didn't think so either. I could not sell it. It was a big thumbs down. Failure on that whole front. So after I picked myself back up, I decided to go narrow and deep, and I settled on telling the story of Elizabeth Van Lew. So there she is right there, and there's her house, which doesn't stand today, but is famous in Richmond. I have to tell you, so one wag said of her, she was never as pretty as her picture showed. Everybody's a critic. So the fascinating thing about her, of course, is that she was both a woman raised as a Southern belle to support the South, mannered, gracious, and she was also a hardened Union spy at the same time. Now, how many of you have heard of her already? How many of you know about her? Virtually everybody, I would say. And how many of you have heard her described as crazy Bet? Fewer. That's interesting. So here's the interesting thing about that. I'm going to tell you that nickname is wrong. or at least inaccurate. And I have to tell you a story to get you there. Here's why I say that. 94 years after the Civil War, a fellow named Edwin C. Fischel, a former active spy during World War II, was poking around some of the hidden corners of the National Archives. And in a disused room, he found this room that was locked. He had to get it unlocked. He walks in, there's all kinds of papers in there, stacks of documents piled to the ceiling, wrapped with red tape tied in a bow. It's the government, all right, you know, red tape. He finds these mysterious documents and he pulls up a chair and he sits down and he starts to read. These neatly organized reports belong to the Army of the Potomac's Bureau of Military Information, the spooks of the Union. The documents had been sitting there for nearly 100 years unread. Imagine what a treasure trove. Now, these are the records for you aficionados out there. I assume there's some like really smart Civil War readers, people who know a lot about it. Yes. Read a lot of books on the topic? No, you just came today blind? Okay. Well, anyway, you're going to learn this guy's name. The Bureau of Military Intelligence head George Sharp was the man who compiled all these records. And he was known for a style of spying called all source. Now, this is going to sound like really rudimentary, why nobody did this before, but what he did was he collected all of the documents from everyone with information during the war, the spies, the deserters, everyone, slaves, freemen, and put them together in reports that were handwritten for Ulysses S. Grant. And this style of spying is what we used in World War I, World War II. It survives today, and it's what Elizabeth Van Lew used on Church Hill, where she stayed, where she lived. I'll show you a picture of George Sharp right here. He's the guy with the handlebar mustache on the left. By the way, after the war, he helped break up Tammany Hall. He was a famous New York attorney. So using those records from the National Archive, Fischel went on to write a 700-page history of Civil War spying. I have it. It's like a doorstop. The thing is huge. But he wrote this about his findings. The most productive espionage operation of the Civil War that has ever been documented on either side was the service performed by Richmond's Unionist underground. And that underground was run by the subject of my book, the Richmond native and Civil War hero, Elizabeth Van Lew. Think about it. She's one of yours. And she ran this incredible spy ring that only 100 years after the war was discovered. When I began my research, I thought, hey, I know all the bright lights of Civil War history. I know Lincoln, Grant, Lee. And as you know, these names are like talismans, right? They're really magical. They inspire kind of an odd hush from us, right? Because we so respect these people. But Elizabeth was a secret hero hidden in a lost archive for a century, a woman nearly buried by history, and I wanted to know why that was. So I started researching. I read every Civil War history I could get my hands on. Many made no mention of her. They didn't know about her. For example, the excellent Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson, no mention of her. Conventional historians, of course, had been focused on presidents, generals, the big battles, and that kind of eliminated talk about women. And of course, I was really interested in what went on in the shadows. Who were the spies? Who were these people? How did they operate? How did they assist the prosecution of the war? Now, to be clear here, she wasn't completely unknown. There's a great academic biography that came out several years ago, written by a professor at UVA. There were newspaper reports in her time, but she was generally misunderstood. The newspaper reports, okay, reporters get it wrong sometimes, I'll admit it. They generally said that, she was sort of a Clara Barton of Richmond, not really understanding the depth of her contribution. So I decided I would really get involved here. I would really start researching her very seriously. And as I did that, I learned some very surprising things, things that told me a lot about Elizabeth and things that told me a lot about me. Civil War myths that I had swallowed whole that I didn't really realize were not true even now. Like many Americans, I assumed that it was inevitable that the North would win the war, right? The North had a higher population, it was more industrialized, more men it could throw at the war, that it was really preordained, baked in the cake. But what I learned is that the hurdle for success for Jeff Davis was far lower. He could simply wage a campaign of attrition, as Washington did in the American Revolutionary War, take shots when he wanted to, keep the war going. That was a solution. For Lincoln to succeed, he had to subdue an area the size of Tsarist Russia, or maybe a better comparison is Western Europe. So the hurdle for the North was very high indeed. Another myth I had was, and I was born in the South, I'm from North Carolina. I had little understanding of the state of the South in the antebellum years. I imagined a largely rural landscape with small, unremarkable cities, certainly nothing like New York City, where I live now. But Richmond wasn't a rural outpost. I learned it was a vibrant city before the war, an industrialized city. Gallego flour, you're seeing here 2 pictures, before the war and after. It's known to non-Richmonders for the crumbling bricks. That's how we know it. But before the war, it was a powerhouse whose brand of flour was known internationally. It was the Coca-Cola of its time. It was sold in South America. It was sold in Europe. And of course, there was lots of tobacco processed here. This is Virginia, after all. Tredegar Iron Works was a primary source of Confederate artillery, locomotive parts, cannons. Without Tredegar, there likely could have been no Southern war machine. And I began to imagine in my mind Elizabeth's world as she took one of her many walks around the city. She did it all the time, just seeing what was going on. And she would have been surrounded by a skyline filled with smokestacks and stinky smells. I did not know this, but I learned that from South America, a guano was transported into the city that would be put on tobacco fields to help tobacco grow. But it stank at times in Richmond in those antebellum days because of that. And I'm just trying to understand what was her world like. All right, you're gonna love this. Same person. Same person. So one of the strange facts that emerged from my research was that literally hundreds of women fought in the Civil War, both sides. And they dressed as men wearing uniforms, as you can see on the right here. As one woman soldier put it to a newspaper reporter after she was discovered, she said, "Well, no one told us we couldn't do it." Following their husbands, their brothers into battle, because otherwise some of them would have been destitute without somebody in their household to earn for them. Some women were drawn by adventures, other by the paycheck, because they could earn much more money as soldiers than more conventionally. So the main reason that women could get away with being soldiers is because, believe it or not, it was illegal for women to wear pants in public at that time. You could be fined. You could be jailed. Now, I sat back and thought about this. Okay, I can't vote. I know I can't sign a contract. If I get married, I have to give my money over to the husband. But now you're telling me I can't wear pants? Are you kidding? So no one suspected somebody in pants to be a soldier. Plus, there were loads of young men fighting with high voices, no facial hair, no gang showers, no medical exams. So women could pass very easily and did so. And some of them even led soldiers in battle. It's a story that's never told. Women also became nurses, as I'm sure you're aware. Before the war, nursing was a man's profession. And when women came in, they came in with the remedies that their grandmothers gave them. Remember, we had no real drugs to help people with infections in the time. Antibiotics had yet to be invented. Women also raised $500 million for the U.S. Sanitary Commission. This was an institution, a private institution that raised money to care for Union soldiers who got injured in the war, and women went out in mass and raised money. It was never done before. I don't think it's been done at scale like that since. And it was a very impressive effort. But that's not all. Women worked in factories, ran the farm, some of the plantation, managing the home front. And some, like Elizabeth, became spies. Now, there's a whole mythology that has been built around women spies. And let me show you one. Show you two. Belle Boyd on your left do you guys know her? Yeah, you've heard of her. 17-year-old Virginia rebel in skirts who shot and killed a Yankee soldier at her home in Martinsburg, Virginia. Why? Because she didn't like the way he spoke to her mother. So she killed him. Or as she put it in her memoir, he addressed my mother and myself in a language as offensive as possible to conceive. So I shot him. All right. So look, the circumstances are a little hazy. It could have been more than just a few bad words. We're not really clear. But she goes on to launch a career as a spy, hanging out in Union camps, collecting gossip, God knows what else, known as La Belle Rebelle. Her most famous exploit, according to her memoirs, was riding a horse onto the battlefield to provide Stonewall Jackson information about Union troop dispositions. Some of these things you sit back and think, did that really happen? There's a quote here from a reporter at the time. A woman in white gliding swiftly out of town. She seemed to heed neither weeds nor fences, but waved a bonnet as she came on. So what do you think she did? After the war, she became an actress. No surprise there. The woman on your right, you probably know her as well, Rose O'Neal Greenhow. She is famous, credited with giving the rebels the tip on the Union's plans at the first Battle of Bull Run or Battle of Manassas, depending on where you're from. But that win, even if it is true, happened early in the war, July 1861. And what's interesting about Rose is the access she had to Union leadership. She knew former presidents, generals, senators, high-ranking military officers. They all visited her salon in the back parlor of her home, just blocks from the White House. The stuff of DC legend. She was a seducer, no doubt about it. So in comes Alan Pinkerton. Now, Pinkerton is known as a detective, and a good one at that, but he wasn't that great of a spy, although he does it during the Civil War. But he decides he's going to arrest Greenhow because she's embarrassing the Union. So he goes to her house, climbs into a hedge, stares through the window where she's in the background talking to a Union officer, and waits for the Union officer to leave. Union officer comes out. He starts running for the Union officer. The Union officer runs in the opposite direction. They run through downtown DC. Finally, Pinkerton grabs him, and somehow Pinkerton ends up in jail instead of the other guy. Not clear how that happens. He spends the night there. He's not happy. Eventually, he's able to turn this whole thing on its head. But in the interim, she is held captive in her own home, a place that they now call Fort Greenhow. And she's still sending information, secrets out to the Confederates. So the Union moves her to a maximum security prison with her daughter, and she's still sending out information. This has become embarrassing now. So the Union throws up its hands and remands her to Richmond, where Jefferson Davis sees his opportunity. This woman is famous. She's persuasive. She can get people to do what she wants. So he sends her to Europe as an emissary of the Confederate government. And that goes really well for her. She doesn't necessarily provide a lot of information, but she does write a book that's very popular in London, and then finally decides to come back to the States. She's on a ship off the coast of North Carolina. When a Union ship approaches them, she jumps off board, drowns. Why? Because she has $2,000 in gold coin sold into her underwear. So you look at these stories and you think, can I take this seriously? And I have to tell you, historians don't. Historians take Greenhow and Boyd not too seriously. And our friend Fischel apparently called them part of the Magnolia and Moonshine School of Civil War. They were regarded as colorful, but not consequential. So the question for me was Elizabeth a magnolia, or was she actually a serious spy? Now, one of the first stories you run into if you're working on history about Elizabeth Van Lew is that she is said to have placed a female Black agent inside the Confederate White House to spy on Jefferson Davis. The story is controversial, but it goes like this. And I have a feeling I need to, no. Elizabeth visited Verena Davis, Jefferson Davis's wife, after hearing the couple was in want of a housemaid. So she goes to the White House of the Civil War. You see it on your left. And I'll tell you about that little room in just a second. Thus, legend has it, Elizabeth Van Lew's servant, Mary Jane Richards, sometimes known as Mary Jane Bowser, entered the service of Verena Davis in her household. Think about it, the most protected sanctum of rebeldom. Van Lew had offered her own personal housemaid, and she was smart, beautiful, and poised. Elizabeth was said to give Mary Jane strict instructions on gathering information from Jefferson Davis's desk in the snug, and that's what you're seeing in that picture right there. I took it myself. It's a fascinating tour, the White House of the Confederacy. Davis hung out in that room. It was tiny, maybe 8 by 10. There's a fireplace, there's that desk, and a little sofa where he would lounge because he was sick most of the time. And it was a... What's that? Is that the right picture? I think so. No, it's not. Do I have the wrong picture? Oh, I didn't give you the other one. Sorry. There you go. Right? So Mary Jane was tasked with reading anything that might be on that desk. It's a tiny little room. Now, Elizabeth had sent her north for education, Mary Jane, and to Liberia to live a free life. Mary Jane hated Liberia, came back, but at the time, she couldn't come back to Richmond, Virginia as a free woman. She had to go live with Elizabeth Van Lew as her servant. Now, I think a lot of people ask the question, is Mary Jane spying in the Davis household true? Neither Elizabeth nor Mary Jane claimed it as the truth during their lifetimes. The story actually came from one of Elizabeth's nieces that was told to a reporter decades later. Maybe, and it's entirely possible that both Elizabeth and Mary self-censored themselves in their time for fear of reprisals. That's a possibility, but it might not be true at all. We really just don't know. The story is hard to resist. Whether true or not, what is clear is that Mary Jane was extraordinary for her time. She was educated, she traveled the world, and she did fight slavery alongside Elizabeth. So when it came to Elizabeth, the more I researched, the more I began to agree with Fischel. She was consequential, in fact, essential to the Union's efforts. And I could tell because I pulled an old reporter trick. I followed the money. And that's when I found the Union, notoriously stingy, gave her a lot of money, $50,000 in today's dollars, a grant from the Union Army to do her work. And so by 1864, Elizabeth was sending a series of dispatches, sometimes 3 a week or more, to Grant's battlefield breakfast table. And legend has it that it was sometimes accompanied by a rose. I don't really know if that's true either. Her slaves, servants, ring members snuck the reports past enemy lines, sometimes written in code, other times penned in her looping cursive hand, which became spikier as the war went on. She managed to sneak agents into the Confederate War and Navy departments. She had wardens of Richmond's notorious POW prisons in her pocket. Her ring was growing as Virginia residents became increasingly weary of the war and desperate for it to end. So through the course of the war, Elizabeth transforms herself from a well-meaning Southern belle known for her charitable impulses into a hardened spymaster, a woman capable of surprising acts. So I want to read a little bit from the book to give you an idea of what she was up for, because I was surprised when I found out. But I have to give you a background first to help you understand what's going on. It's deep in the book. It's winter 1864. Gettysburg is a memory. The siege of Petersburg has been on for 6 months. Richmond is in a sorry state. People are starving. Inflation is rampant. And calls for a raid to free Union officers and soldiers from the city's many notorious prisons are common and rising. Those voices are getting louder. So Elizabeth calls for a raid, and Lincoln authorizes the raid. He orders this raid to be led by a fellow named Hugh Judson Kilpatrick. Nice sideburns. Now, here's something you might not know. He turns out to be the great-great-great-grandfather of CNN anchor Anderson Cooper. Right? Who knew? Okay, leading a smaller force, Ulrich Dahlgren, I'll show you here. What a handsome guy. He was a heartthrob in the antebellum days. The newspapers wrote about him. He was famous. He was the son of a naval commander, knew Lincoln, hung out with Lincoln, a very young man at the time, and he rose through the ranks quickly. He lost part of his leg in an early battle. What they planned, this raid would be a classic pincer movement, and I assume many of you have heard of the Dahlgren raid. Kilpatrick would threaten Richmond from the north, drawing attention and manpower to his position, while Dahlgren would cross the James, come in from the south with a smaller unit, just 500 cavalrymen compared to Cavalry's 4,000. And Ulrich Dahlgren would free the prisoners. But it all went horribly wrong, just terribly wrong. Dahlgren gets killed. His body is taken by the Confederates, put on display at a train depot at the York River. I mean, it's a disaster in many ways. The Confederates then bury him in Oakwood Cemetery. And Elizabeth, who wanted to see this happen, was so upset that she decided that she would order the body retrieved. We're going to dig him up, and I'm going to send members of my spy ring to do that. So that's the setup. It took a little while, but I think you're with me, yeah? All right. Here's the book. The night was moonless and cold. Rain pelted on the backs of the 3 hunched men as they followed a fourth, the groundskeeper. They stumbled across the muddy ground, slack with water, their faces intermittently etched by lightning. It was a night fit for grave robbers, and that is exactly what they were. Thunder rolled as if God himself was commenting on their work. The groundskeeper pointed to the spot they had come to see. Breaking out crude shovels of iron and wood, they began to dig. Their objective, Dahlgren's flimsy pine coffin. The boy had been dead more than a month. The 3 risked detection at any moment by Confederate soldiers. The penalty for moving the body, if discovered, would be extreme. Death by hanging or perhaps a firing squad. Neither option was appealing, so they kept at their work, moving quickly and quietly, their hearts in their throats. In short order, they located the casket. Next came the worst of their assignment, prying it open to make sure it was the right one. They couldn't risk alerting the enemy by lighting a torch against the dark, so once they got the casket open, one of the spies shoved his hands inside, his fingers feeling for the body. The whole book isn't like this. No right leg below the knee. The man was also missing the little finger of his right hand. They had gotten it right. The decaying body of Lieutenant Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren was back in the hands of Union operatives, though not yet back on Union soil. And I know there's another page to this here. Note to self, make sure you got it all. So Dahlgren's body is taken to the farm of a Union operative, and the next morning, who appears but the spymaster, Elizabeth Van Lew. Elizabeth met her ring at Rowley's farm, eager to reclaim Dahlgren's body. She likely wore the skirt and jacket of a farm woman to conceal her identity. She moved quickly to the workshop, steeling herself for what she was about to see. Crossing the threshold, Elizabeth immediately noticed a smell like rotten eggs. But the stench didn't stop her. She was familiar with the odor of death. Dahlgren's body was laid out on a table, and encircling him were her Unionist agents, her friends and confidants. American culture, following the example of Victorians, was obsessed with death. Cultural practices and habits were important because they helped prepare a dying person's soul for the afterlife. A calm look on a dead person's face signaled they were at peace and ready for death. It was important for Elizabeth to comfort his family with a story of his serene demeanor. But the only problem for Elizabeth was that Dahlgren had been cut down on the battlefield. The last thing on his mind was meeting his maker. As a result, according to the Richmond papers, his face bore a look of agony. Elizabeth would have to improvise. She leaned down and got a closer look at his face. Her fingertips skimmed his chest and what was left of his limbs. This is from her diary, it's true. The skin was dirty and scratched. His face was yellow-green, with the most exposed parts of it, like his nose, dried out and brown. His eyes opaque, the blue irises glazed over. Poor Dahlgren, Elizabeth thought. The kill shot to his back had left a large wound. Elizabeth must have wondered whether Dahlgren had been caught by the fatal blow as he was fleeing the scene. Was he running in fear? But there was no time for second thought. She knew her very presence here on this remote farm was dangerous. She was alert for the sound of hooves, men on horseback, the slap of a rifle butt against a thigh. Any of it would portend exposure of her work and her spy ring. She must finish her task. So the ring holds an informal funeral ceremony, singing a hymn and praying together. So at this point in my research, I began to think, wow, this is not what I expected, right? This is a woman who was not the quiet, demure little spy that I thought. She didn't just stay in her home and write. I really do need to do this better. She actually got out there and she went places. She actually went to the War Department one time and directly approached a Confederate officer to turn him into a Union agent. It worked. She bribed people when she couldn't convince them to do what she wanted. She impoverished herself. In doing this research, I became a huge fan of hers. I thought she was relentless. She had just an incredible willpower that you seldom seen. She knew what she wanted. She may have been a Southern belle, but she was committed to Virginia, an older Virginia, the Commonwealth that produced so many presidents. She wanted to see it return to what it was like before, and she wanted to end slavery. She was a fierce abolitionist. I have come to respect her, and it's so funny. In the final days of writing the book, I became obsessed with the idea that I could hear her dress rustling behind me as I was pounding on the computer. That's how real she became for me. I guess that's what happens to you when you spend 3 years with a woman trying to understand her. But I appreciate your listening, and I think we're ready for Q&A, right?
At what point did the people of Richmond realize she was a spy?
Where did that come from? Raise your hand. Oh, hi. Well, different people realized at different times. Her neighbors were familiar with the idea that she and her mother had been against secession from the get-go. And the word kind of leaked around the city, but everybody was kind of prosecuting a war. So, they would occasionally come for her and then forget about it and move on to some other pressing task. But one day in the middle of the war, Elizabeth sat home and somebody knocks, and it's 2 Confederate detectives. coming to search the house. And she has 3 Union officers on the 3rd floor hidden in her attic, and they don't know that they're about to be searched. So she's worried that they're going to cough or knock the wall or something's going to happen. And she takes these 2 detectives on this very slow tour of her house away from the 3rd floor. By the time they get to the attic, they're so hungry, and she's promised them food, that they kind of wind everything up, and go on their way. She was able to manipulate the situation because she was just very smart about how to talk to people. And that was all her Southern Belle training and education. I hope that answered your question. Anybody else? I can hear you.
What about this, the person that worked for her was Maggie Walker's mother?
So there is this really interesting, and actually there's somebody here who knows a lot about this, who's a national park ranger and works in that museum. And Maggie Walker was an amazing woman who had an incredible influence, especially on Black Americans, starting at Penny Bank. Am I right? Is that right, Nate?
Penny Savings Bank.
Yeah, that influenced people for generations. So much came out of that household that was positive. It wasn't just Elizabeth Van Lew. It was the people who worked with her and influenced her. That's a great question. We've got one right here.
What was her education and activity before the war?
So she'd been educated in Philadelphia. Her mother had her educated in Philadelphia. At the time, Southern Belles tend to be educated with other women. And, it was a more, it's interesting, women had a better education in Virginia during the Revolutionary War than they did during the Civil War, because women were, taught sewing and all the, how they were supposed to act, that kind of thing, rather than history and heavier topics. So Elizabeth went to Philadelphia, where she got a very good education, and she also ran into abolitionists for the first time. And that may be what influenced what she did for years to come.
Where did the family's wealth
That's a great question. So her parents, neither of them were originally from Richmond, right? Her father came from Long Island. He comes down here. He opens up, get this, like a Home Depot. And he sells to the University of Virginia, and he sells to everybody. He's well-known, well-liked. They own slaves. I mean, this is a very controversial story, right? She has a very mixed background, Elizabeth Van Lew does. Her mother came from Philadelphia, and she was the granddaughter of an abolitionist there who was involved in not the Declaration of Independence, but the signing of the Constitution. Yeah, he was famous. He was a mayor of Philadelphia and very influential in her life. And Elizabeth would have heard stories about him over and over again. He founded an abolitionist society in Philadelphia that went on for years.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this family dealt with this history of abolitionist history, and yet they had slaves.
So that's a great question. So the context I would give you, because it's difficult, right? Here she is, an abolitionist, and her household owned slaves. This is something she fought with her dad about. At the time in the South, being upcoming and rising in society, you had slaves. That's how people showed their wealth. I know it's horrific, but it's true. And so they had, I think they also had a farm outside the city. So between those 2 properties, they had at least a dozen slaves, fewer later in the war. And Elizabeth, slowly either helped them buy themselves out of slavery or freed them. Some of them, she actually sent the entire family north. She was very much against it. And some of them just stayed with her. There weren't many options for people in that situation.
What did she do after the war? Was she ostracized by the Richmond community?
Yes. Richmond did not like her. Oh, this allows me to tell the story. I'm so happy. So Grant makes her postmaster here, which is a very big job, very fancy. And she's great at it. And she improves performance of the Postal Service. Richmond doesn't care. This is a very political job, and they want to put in somebody of their own to run it because, it's a powerful position, and she doesn't run it that way. As the years go on, she takes on different jobs, very little success, and she's ostracized by the city. After her death, that mansion, that fabulous house, is occupied by historical society, different groups over the years. And finally, it's torn down by the city. And as you know, on that location right now, there's an elementary school, but it's not named for her, which tells you something about, I guess, the city's attitude towards her and whether or not it lingers. It's odd to me. There's a sign in front with her name on it, but the school itself is not named for her. I find it odd.
Does she remain a spinster the whole time?
I think spinster's a harsh word, don't you? Okay, so I thought about this because, her family would say that she was engaged as a young woman and that he died somehow of malaria or something. I don't know. But she was powerful, right? She had a lot of money. She could do anything she wanted. She lived in one of the best houses in Richmond. Getting married would have thrown all of that into the wind. I don't know. I might have been a spinster too.
What is her first documented spy mission?
Okay, let's see. Well, the first thing I talk about in the book, because at first what she really wanted to do was to help Union officers held in prisons in the city. The conditions were poor, desperate. By the middle of the war, little Richmond kids who were so hungry that they would go to the prisons and beg for food. But of course, the prisons didn't have food either. So in the early days of the war, she goes to Confederate officers who run these prisons and asks for access. Can I go in? Can I take them food? Can I visit them? And she fails twice. 2 different Confederate officers are like, no, you're a Southern lady. Go be a Southern lady. The third time, she goes in and she decides to change tactics. And she tells the officer there, she says, "Why, your hair is so beautiful, it should adorn a statue of Janus." He falls over like a bag of potatoes and gives her access and becomes someone who, he doesn't befriend her, but he helps her throughout the war do what she needs to do. Her position in society bought her a lot of access. People were afraid to confront her because of her money and her power. And she knew how to talk to people. She knew how to influence people, how to persuade them. So she had all of these incredible assets that she deployed to get done what she wanted to do.
What, in your opinion, was her most daring mission?
So she did a lot of things, but one thing that I found really interesting and kind of funny, but it was dangerous, this Dahlgren raid, right? Well, according to a version of this story that was written by a member of her ring who was with her at the time, they decided to go to talk to the general who was organizing the raid. And that was in Northern Virginia, which was across enemy lines, the place they were going to. So they took a train. So she and her old mother sit together on this train, could have been discovered. They were crossing enemy lines. They go to this location and they track down Anderson Cooper's great-great-great-great-grandfather and talk to him about plans for the raid. And of course, she would have been able to contribute how to get into the city, what the best roads were to use, what to watch out for, what the Confederates were doing at the time. And she does that. At the same time, at this location, the soldiers there are preparing for something called the Washington Ball. And they build this incredible edifice to hold the ball in the middle of a battlefield out of anything they can find. They take down houses, they chop down pine trees, they decorate the whole place. It's really kind of an amazing scene and a big party. And it's so popular that senators come from Washington to go. It seems stupid, right? Well, it was stupid. And a bunch of young women come down, right? Well, what would be the northern version of a belle, women in their, teens. They're wary mothers following them. There's a big party. It goes on all night long. And in the course of that party, there's a cross-dressing Confederate spy, a man dressed as a woman who gets secrets about the disposition of Union soldiers and gives it to the South. So things were going on at many levels. And it's, to me, the vision, the idea of that always kind of captured me. A big ball in the middle of a war. Who thought that was a great idea? But interesting. Anything else?
Yes. You mentioned the Mary Jane Bowser connection, and I understand that there's little or no documentation really to support much of what might be thought of as an opportunity for Mary Jane Bowser. But did you feel that you came across a lot of circumstantial evidence that would inform how much of a role she played?
So there is no doubt that she helped Elizabeth Van Lew during the war. That is absolutely true. And among the things she did is that she would tap the slave network. So remember, at this time, you always think of slaves being on plantations, but here in Richmond, they were working in households and in factories. So she would talk to the household slaves of the major leaders of the Confederate Army and, or the effort here in Richmond. And she would get information about what was going on. This was essential to what Elizabeth did. And that was collected by Mary Jane. She also, Elizabeth would take tours of the prisons, walk around the prisons, and Mary Jane would go with her on her arm. And people that Elizabeth had on the payroll inside the prisons would tell the prisoners, that's Elizabeth Van Lew, and this woman will help you escape this prison and we'll help you do that. So, she was always there doing things. She overheard conversations all the time that were critically important. And according to her, she actually did enter the Confederate White House once. And she was tossed out almost immediately by Davis. So it's entirely possible that we don't know that story because everybody was afraid that something was going to happen to them, both Mary Jane and Elizabeth. But I can't really hang my hat on anything that feels substantial about her working in that White House.
Did she live here for the remainder of her life?
She lived here for the remainder of her life, and she died in the house, the picture of which I showed you, and she was surrounded by a picture of Ulysses S. Grant looked down on her. A bust of Lincoln was there. She was surrounded by the men she loved. Yep, she's buried here. She's buried here, and folks in Boston who were fans of hers provided the headstone. She was buried up and down, not lying out, because where she was buried was really crowded over where her family. I can't remember the name of the cemetery, sorry. Thank you.
So you told an earlier story that when she first went to, I think, the jail, the jailer said, go back and continue to be a Southern belle. So my question is, we're at a time before suffrage, during this Southern belle era. How was it that she was able to convince the higher ups, the generals, the presidents, the lieutenants, that to take her seriously, to, the information that she gave, like where troops are going to be, we should trust
This is
her?
a great question. So understand, she's sort of teaching herself how to do this. She's running herself as a spy in the beginning of the war, right? And initially, she would send her reports to the White House, like to whom it may concern. She had no idea who to talk to. I mean, imagine that. Eventually, a general named Butler, Benjamin Butler, who was a whole piece of work in himself. You got to read that in the book. That was pretty crazy. He found her and gave her one of those ciphers, which would allow her to write her letters, her reports in code, and she would send them as if she was his niece, and use disappearing ink, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of what she did, though, were using tactics that she figured out on her own. So as Butler got used to her and started using her, he was impressed so much that Ulysses S. Grant's slave operators took her away from Butler and said, we like her, we're going to use her. We see her reports, they're great. And one of her reports actually went to Lincoln's desk. I hope that answered your question.
Do we have any more questions? One at the front. There we go.
I may have missed this earlier in your talk. How did her messages physically get from downtown Richmond to the White House?
Okay, so this is a great question. So initially what she did was she would write these notes, and her slaves and servants would put them in the heels of their shoes. They created these big bulky shoes with a little hole in the heel, and they would walk, and the slaves would walk it across, right? They weren't under suspicion. They could kind of go anywhere. And they would walk it across the river. And remember, Grant was sitting just across the river by the middle of the war, and the reports were taken that way. They almost got caught a couple of times doing this, and some folks almost really got into trouble. But that's the way it started. That's the way it went mostly. Eventually, Grant's people started coming closer and closer to Vanloo to get as much information as they could, and relied less on the slaves to do it. They would send somebody on a horse down to the river. And I mean, anything they could imagine that might work, they would try it.
Do we have a final question? I see one down here.
Did you include any of these reports? Did you include any of these, any of her reports in your book, or did you come across any?
No, I should have. And I had some great stuff from a historian named William Feiss, who wrote a book about Grant's work and spies during the Civil War. And he has pictures of her handwriting at the time. So, you know, she, in early years of the war, that's this big loopy cursive. And then by the end of the war, she is so exhausted, freaked out, and tired. It's this like spiky, it's really hard to read. But Feiss has some of that material. I actually have some of it in the book that I quote. By the end of the war, she's desperate. She wants change, and she's calling on the Union government to get down here to Richmond and close out this war. She says that the city is ready for the raid, ready for invasion, and they need to move now. But as you know, it happened a slightly different way because most of the action centered on Petersburg in those final days.
I think that's going to be all we have time for today. We're just coming up on 1 o'clock. So as a reminder, Gerri is going to be in Commonwealth Hall signing copies of her book. They're going to be available in our gift shop. And if you do have any more questions, I'm sure Gerri will be able to answer them then.
Yes.
So let's give her another fantastic round of applause.